Ring them bells for me, ring them bells for me, ring them bells, and I'll come a-running home. Ring them bells for me, Lord, ring your bells for me, ring your bells, and I'll come a-running home.
Here in central Kentucky lies the world's longest cave system, the appropriately named Mammoth Cave. Over 400 miles of interconnected, mapped, and explored caverns, with more still being found. Mammoth Cave is part of the U.S. National Park System, a World Heritage Site, and a World Biosphere Reserve. Mammoth Cave is more than a geological wonder. It has long been the focus of local commerce and community. Many local families, both black and white, can trace multiple generations of individuals in their family trees who have worked in the cave as guides or on the cave grounds. The family names in this diverse heritage include, among others, Wilson, Hanson, Furlong, Hunt, Cutliff, Nelson, Bransford, and Bishop. This documentary focuses on the African-American legacy of the park from the time of slavery to the present day.
I lost the light of one day. I saw high domes and bottomless pits, heard the voice of unseen waterfalls, paddled 3/4 of a mile in the deep Echo River, whose waters are peopled with the blind fish, crossed the stream's Leith and Styx. Plied with music and guns, the echoes in these alarming galleries saw every form of stalagmite and stalactite in the sculptured and fretted chambers. We shot Bengal lights into the vaults and groins of the starry cathedrals and examined all the masterpieces which the four combined engineers, water, limestone, gravitation, and time, could make in the dark.
Mammoth Cave played an important role in the developmental history of the United States. In the early 1800s, saltpeter was mined here in great quantities. Saltpeter is an essential component of gunpowder.
During the War of 1812, the British blocked the coast and cut off supplies of gunpowder, and so saltpeter production at Mammoth Cave went into high gear. As many as 70 slaves and miners worked around the clock, producing saltpeter for the combat effort. Without the efforts of these black slaves, the United States may very well have lost the battle to the British forces. After the war, the mining operation shut down, and the cave was only visited by an occasional tourist. In 1838, Franklin Garvin, a businessman and lawyer from Glasgow, Kentucky, purchased Mammoth Cave with the goal of making a major tourist destination. Franklin Garvin brought 3 slaves, Stephen Bishop, Nick Bransford, and Madison Bransford, to the cave with the goal of expanding the tourist routes in the cave and to upgrade and expand the hotel on the property.
Franklin paid right at $5,000 for the cave. During his time, even though it was just a short 2 years, that so much development of the cave was done. And a lot of that, of course, was thanks to Stephen Bishop and the Bransfords and the rest of the early guides there.
So when Stephen Bishop was brought to the cave, he had some folks to learn from. He had Archibald Miller Jr., who's already been in the cave, and he had Joseph Shackelford as well. There was a survey of the cave and a guidebook that was done just a couple years before he came to the cave, so he had this heritage already to come from. So he had this basis, but apparently that was not enough. He had to explore more. And within 1 year, he already discovered Gordon's Dome, which was huge. And then from there, there's a place called the Bottomless Pit. And legend has it, he put a ladder across this chasm, across the Bottomless Pit, which led to tons of other great discoveries, doubling, tripling the size of the cave within a couple years.
Beyond the pit, he found tens of miles of new, spectacular passageways. He discovered rivers in the lowest reaches of the cave known to visitors today as the Echo River, the Roaring River, and the River Styx. And in these rivers, he discovered blind, eyeless white fish and crayfish. These are called troglodytic organisms, and they are adapted to live their entire lives in the complete darkness of the cave.
All of the records indicate that he had this amazing memory, that he could remember anything. So people would come in and he could repeat anything people have to say, or in this instance, he could remember every single passage of the cave. So there wasn't a great guidebook published for years. It was 1838 when he came in. They discovered so much more, so everything was inadequate from that time. So he penciled this map at Locust Grove, and Colonel George Grahn, which was John Grahn's brother, inked the whole map, and it was eventually published in this guidebook that went out everywhere in 1845. So this really put him on the map, and he got his name published. Stephen Bishop, he got full credit, which was very unusual for a slave.
I placed a guide in the cave, the celebrated and great Stephen, and he aided in making the discoveries. He was the first person who ever crossed the Bottomless Pit, and he, myself, and another person whose name I've forgotten were the only persons ever at the bottom of Gorin's Dome to my knowledge. After Stephen crossed the Bottomless Pit, we discovered all that part of the cave now known beyond that point. Previous to those discoveries, all interest centered in what is known as the Old Cave. But now, many of these points are but little known, although, as Stephen was wont to say, they were grand, gloomy, and peculiar. Stephen was a self-educated man. He had a fine genius, a great fund of wit and humor, some little knowledge of Latin and Greek, and much knowledge of geology. But his greatest talent was his perfect knowledge of men.
Like, the biggest thing of all that I love is this documentation from 1852, Observations in Slavery. There was this man named Russell Lant Carpenter that came in, and he was basically researching and telling the world about all these slaves that he's come across. And one of them was Stephen Bishop. And Stephen knows that he was in the company of Frederick Douglass, who is by far America's most famous former slave. And through this account, they talk about it, and Stephen's been going to all these different caves. He tells Russell he's been going to 40 different caves around the region. But the thing that Russell leaves with is that he says Stephen Bishop is the most intelligent slave, most impressive slave he has ever met. And this is a man who met Frederick Douglass. So it gives me goosebumps just thinking about that. This is a piece of unearthed history. This man who is world famous, he's regarded as one of the smartest slaves of all time, even above Frederick Douglass. And still not a lot is known about him, so we're hoping to change that.
I have no doubt that Stephen Bishop explored that cave because he loved to find new things. I think he had the same emotional attachment to caving that modern day cavers have. They want to know what's around the next corner. They want to know if they can discover a part of the cave that nobody has seen before. He, of course, had experienced the thrill of crawling into places and discovering a wonderful place. It was named Gorin's Dome after his owner at the time. And so for that, he was celebrated. So I'm sure he was encouraged to continue his exploring, and he did it in a systematic way, and we know that because he drew a map of his discoveries, which is still looked at today, and as a schematic map, it's pretty good.
Stephen Bishop left a lasting legacy on Mammoth Cave. Serious cavers basically expect to be tripping over him everywhere they go. When exploring a new cave, they half expect to see his signature saying, "Stephen Bishop was here before you." Ironically, he died in 1857, only a year after his emancipation. And one of the enduring mysteries of Mammoth Cave is that no one really knows how he died.
About 20 years after his death, there was a man who was a rich banker from Philadelphia, James Mellon, and he came to the cave because he read some of these books about Stephen Bishop. He read the W. Stunt Forward's An Historic and Descriptive Guide of Mammoth Cave. Came knowing about Stephen Bishop. He actually dined with Charlotte Bishop, Stephen's widow, who told him all these stories, and he was really inspired to buy him a tombstone. He didn't have a grave marker. He was world famous, but he didn't have any identification here at the cave after the fact. So basically, a couple years after that, they sent a Union soldier's tombstone. Basically, a family of a deceased Union Civil War soldier could not pay for their tombstone, so he reused it. So there's the flag and the sabers on top, and then there's his information down below. Unfortunately, it's incorrect. It says he died in July of 1859. We know from the records he died at least probably May or sooner of 1857. But at least there's a marker, and it's, again, part of the legacy and the folklore of Stephen Bishop as much as anything here at the cave.
Many of the slaves take on the last name of their owners, and Stephen Bishop also, we know, did that. There's many places on the walls of the cave where you can actually see Stephen Grahn written on the walls. There's also another place in the cave where you see the signature Stephen Cron, taking on the last name of Dr. Cron. And then shortly thereafter, after his map is published in 1844, you start to see Stephen Bishop, and it seemed that he kept the name Stephen Bishop throughout the rest of his life. In many places in Mammoth Cave, especially in Gothic Avenue, there are smoke writing on the ceiling. And this smoke writing on the ceiling was done by early visitors that came to Mammoth Cave, and they wanted to leave their mark. The guides would provide a candle and a long stick, and maybe for a small tip or a fee, or maybe the visitors would bring in their own candle, they would smoke dot by dot their name. Many of these signatures on the ceiling are very elaborately done. The smoke writing on the cave walls date back to the very early tours beginning in the cave, 1816. A lot of 1820, 1830 signatures. Those signatures are still very visible today, completely preserved in the cave environment. It seems that this continued very extensively right up through the Civil War, and shortly after the Civil War you start to see a lot of these smoke signatures fading away.
Dr. John Grahn purchased the cave from Franklin Gorin in 1839 for a sum of $10,000. He purchased Stephen Bishop as part of that deal and continued the lease of Nick Bransford and Madison Bransford. Dr. Grahn was a physician and a member of a wealthy Louisville family. He was the son of William Grahn and Lucy Clark, sister of the famous William Clark of the Lewis and Clark expedition, and he was the grandson of Brigadier General George Rogers Clark, a soldier from Virginia and the highest-ranking American military officer on the northwestern frontier during the American Revolutionary War. By the 1830s, consumption, or tuberculosis, was a deadly disease that had already taken several members of Dr. Grahn's family. He had heard about the remarkable curative and healthful properties of the cave from many early visitors. He wondered if the cave air would help relieve the symptoms of consumption or even cure it completely. Dr. Grahn's theory that the cave's uniform atmosphere would aid in the treatment of respiratory illness was well thought of at the time and was lauded in several reputable medical journals. By 1843, Dr. Grahn had built a number of cabins within the cave to serve as residences for patients suffering from the disease.
It's hard to imagine these people with this dreaded disease knowing that it's a death sentence, and every day their life is getting worse and worse. And then that these days being in the cave being their worst, most miserable days, and yet they're interacting with tour groups coming through the cave, having the best days of their life, on vacation, seeing one of the world wonders.
Alfred was a slave from Dr. Crone's plantation in Louisville. He'd been brought in to both work with the consumptive patients and to be a cave guide. In 1855, he described the conditions at the hospital to Mr. Bayard Taylor, a cave visitor. "I was one of the waiters who attended upon them," said Alfred. "I used to stand on that rock and blow the horn to call them to dinner. There were 15 of them, and they looked more like a company of skeletons than anything else. One of the number died here. His case was hopeless when he entered, and even when conscious that his end was near, he refused to leave. I can conceive of one man being benefited by a residence in the cave, but the idea of a company of lank, cadaverous invalids wandering about in the awful gloom and silence, broken only by their hollow coughs, doubly hollow and sepulchral there, is terrible." The experiment, which lasted from September 1843 until January 1844, was a failure. The patients residing in the cave either became worse or died. Dr. Grahn himself caught and died of the disease in 1849. Upon his death, he willed that one of his personal servants be freed immediately, and the rest of the slaves be paid a small salary and be freed from bondage 7 years after his death. Nick Bransford is the next well-known slave who was first brought to Mammoth Cave. We know little about his family background. What we do know comes from a letter he dictated after the Civil War that was sent to some of the descendants of his original owner, Thomas Bard Bransford, who had moved to Texas.
In the letter, he mentions his mother and his father Joe, a blacksmith crossing the mountains from Virginia into Kentucky. Although we're not sure what Nick's life looked like before Stephen Bishop died, we do know that when he became a cave guide, he was very skilled and likable. We also know that later on, Nick ended up marrying Stephen's widow, Charlotte Brown. An account published in the Cincinnati Commercial in 1866 by J.W.M. gives a picture of the man. Nick, the guide, is a thoughtful Negro of 40 or thereabouts, wears a roundabout and felt hat of very uncertain texture and shape. He is short, rather lean, has crisp, spreading wool, and walks with what is called the cave gait, the feet having a searching way of touching the ground, as if they were not quite sure they are not feelers. Nick is a joker. A guide for 28 years, he has caught something from every party he has led, and touch him where you will find a ready pun. He mingles instruction with fun. It is not garrulous or satirical. If you ask him where the avenue leads to, he'll probably first say that it don't go nowhere, it stays right here, and then give the information. That prop against the wall holds up the cave. In 1863, Nick Bransford, guide Frank de Munbrun, and Englishman F.J. Stevenson were all lowered to the bottom of the Maelstrom, a deep pit that marked the end of the cave trail in Cleveland Avenue. F.J. Stevenson was known for being adventurous and pushing Nick to help him explore more and more in the cave. Although Nick was one of the few men at the time to have descended to the bottom of the pit, he never mentioned it when giving tours. On another occasion, when exploring the Echo River, F.J. Stevenson left Nick stranded on a mud bank along the shore while he and 3 others maneuvered the boat further downstream. Stevenson returned several hours later, and Nick was not happy about the incident. Stevenson wrote that Nick had made up his mind that I had met with an accident and that he would be left alone to die in the darkness. He swore he would go no more with me on voyages of discovery for love or money. Nick had 2 daughters, Hannah and Annie. Nick's daughter Hannah married guide William Garvin in 1876. Nick was a caring, giving man. Though illiterate himself, he donated the land for the segregated Mammoth Cave School, where his grandchildren learned to read and write. He was one of the first deacons of the Pleasant Union Baptist Church that used to stand in the park. Nick continued to work at Mammoth Cave until he died in 1895, giving over half a century of his life to the guiding profession.
Materson Bransford was the third of 3 slaves brought by Franklin Gorin to work at his new Mammoth Cave property in 1838. Both he and Nick Bransford were leased from their owner, Thomas Bard Bransford, to Franklin Gorin for a fee of $100 per year. It is noteworthy that Materson was not only Thomas Bard Bransford's property, but he was also his biological son, born to a slave girl known as Little Hannah, sometime around 1820. After his arrival at Mammoth Cave, Mat soon began leading tours along with Stephen Bishop and exploring the cave. When his father and owner died in 1853, he was inherited by his half-brother Thomas Lewis Bransford. The ongoing slave lease agreement assigning he and Nick to work at Mammoth Cave was allowed to continue. In 1859, in his guidebook, The Mammoth Cave of Kentucky, writes, "There are 4 guides at the cave, viz., Mat and Nicholas Bransford, colored, and Messrs. L. W. David and F. M. Dimmenbrunn. Mat is 37 years old and has acted in the capacity of guide for 19 years. He is polite and affable, and is particular in calling attention to everything worthy of observation. The aggregate distance he has traveled in the cave is not less than 50,000 miles."
In 1863, after he became well known as a tour guide and knowledgeable in his work, Madison Bransford traveled on his own to Louisville to have a formal portrait taken. Because of his status as a guide, his visit was covered by the Louisville Courier-Journal, August 20th. The article read in part, "Madison is owned by Thomas L. Bransford, late of Nashville, but at present a seeker after his rights in the South. Although by no means scientific, he is familiar with the geographical and chemical formations peculiar to the cave, and discourses of all its wonders with an apparent knowledge of his subjects that would do credit to Professor Benjamin Silliman. Mat arrived in this city yesterday and is a guest of our friends of the Louisville Hotel. He will sit for his portrait today at George H. Brown's daguerreotype saloon, after which he will take a shy at whatever is worth looking at the above ground thereabouts, returning to the cave tomorrow. In 1866, Charles Waldeck, over a period of 4 months, took 42 stereo photographs within Mammoth Cave, becoming one of the earliest successful cave photographers. Madison Bransford played an important role in that effort, guiding Waldeck and his assistants, and carrying his heavy photographic equipment to distant areas of the cave. There are no photographs of Mat taken within the cave, but photograph number 6 in the stereo series, entitled Mouth of the Cave, shows Mat as one of 3 people sitting just outside the cave entrance. An additional 2 unpublished photographs, also taken just outside the entrance, also include images of Mat Bransford. In 1864, Captain J.R. Rusling of the Union Army visited Mammoth Cave and spoke to Mat about his family. Mat is married, and in his time he has had 4 of what Christians call children, but Kentuckians chattels. 3 of these, 2 girls and a boy, have been sold from him. He has 1 boy still left, a lad about 10 years old, who, thanks to the rebellion, will probably be left to him. 2 of his children, a boy and a girl, were sold from him when only about 7 or 8 years old. A man named Shaw bought them both, but he soon became bankrupt, and they both went to the auction block, whence they were sold by the sheriff to the highest bidder, 1 to 1 purchaser as it happened, and 1 to another. The other girl was sold at another time, as she grew up, to a man named John Coates, who, with a meanness worthy of a dabbler in human flesh, afterward removed to Illinois, and then returned and sold her. Said I, Uncle Mat, I don't suppose you missed those children much. You colored people never do, they say. Sure, Captain. Don't you believe that? Colored folks has feelings just like white folks. Of course, as a man, I can bear such things, do it mighty hard at first. But it most killed the old woman, that's a fact. See the little toads just come to running about and talking lively sort, as bright as crickets and happy as the birds in the trees, and the mother was always kind of tender woman anyhow, and to her they seemed to be the nicest children you ever did see. Thought it would have killed her. She went round kind of crazy like for a long time, but what can niggas do? Wasn't no use nohow, so we come at last to bed. We're come to taking the older child, we's older, and seen so much of this thing that we just give her up to the worst and bore it best we could. I asked him where his wife was now. Several years now, she'd been living near me, only 2.5 miles or so off. I saved money enough from what Jim had given me for going in the cave to put up a little house. Massa Doyle, where she lived, don't charge us anything for renting ground, so we just lived there. Got a good house and plenty of furniture. We get along nice. We had chillin' back. And how does Mr. Doyle treat your wife? Is he a good master? Why, yes, Master Doyle's not so bad. Mighty close, though. Makes her step round lively and keeps her lit up. Would fight her sometimes, I reckon, if he dared. You mean he would whip her? Just so, only he's afeard I'd run off. See, I've been with white folks a heap and talked so much about the North that I could cut away any time if only I pleased. Master Doyle knows this mighty well, so he leaves us alone. I wanted Mat to come to Nashville and be free at once, but the old man said he couldn't part with the cave. Seemed most like a child now, you know. Been together so long.
It's told to me that the owner of the mother had the right to sell the offspring of slaves at will. Parthena was a Coates, and I was told that she and Mat were allowed to jump the broomstick. That's an old world tradition. It's some young people practice today that they jump to the broomstick and the preacher says you're married. The 4 children that I'm aware of was Henry Bransford, my great-grandfather, a boy named Thomas, who the record book describes as palsy, and he'll never probably be able to work in the cave, and 2 early teenage girls. Well, Parthena's owner, in a year's time, put them on the auction block and they were sold from them. But we do know that it seems that they saw fit to keep Henry, my great-grandfather. And we've got reasonable documentation in more recent years that he was able to get one of the girls back after the Civil War. But my father said old folks told him she was about 15 and she had a child. Thomas, my daddy told me that after the Civil War, they heard that Thomas was sold into Memphis, Tennessee. We don't know for sure what became of Thomas.
Something interesting about the history of Mammoth Cave is that you had slaves guiding tours for prominently the very wealthy white visitors. So you have this time period where inside Mammoth Cave, the culture and world is sort of reversed for a few hours each day, where the white people have to follow and do as the guide says, to stay safe, to know where they're going, to be led out of the cave. You had a black person in charge of a group of white people.
They were also warned at times not to have lunch with free people in the cave. They were reminded their role as slave guides, and they were famous and smart, but also people in charge of them made sure that they knew what their role were in society. At the end of the day, although they had toured famous, intelligent people through the cave, and they were masterful guides on the ground, I sometimes realized that once they came back to the surface, whether they were free all day, when they came back to the hotel and the grounds, they were still slaves.
Slavery is an abomination under any form. I say it's like arguing about the size of the jail cells. A bigger jail cell doesn't make jail any more appealing.
After the end of the Civil War, and after he and the rest of the slave guides gained their freedom, Materson continued to work as a guide at Mammoth Cave for another 30 years, alongside his son Henry Bransford. Madison Bransford died on October 13, 1895. His obituary in the Glasgow Weekly Times reads in part, "Old Mat, the guide, died at his home near Mammoth Cave on the morning of the 13th. He served in the capacity of guide for about 47 years, and he had made more than 12,000 trips in the cave. He was faithful to his duty and honorable to every trust, always did his work willingly and cheerfully, and never failed to make friends with the parties under his guidance." Henry, Mat's only remaining child, was able to remain at Mammoth Cave with his family. He was taught the routes through the cave by his father, and followed in his footsteps, becoming a guide at Mammoth Cave. He was a hard-working man who also worked as a farmer and raised a large family in addition to being a guide.
One of the things that my dad would say about his grandfather, my great-grandfather Henry Bransford, was that he was so in love with the cave that he would work in the cave every chance he had. And he'd come back up Flint Ridge with the oxen or mules cutting logs by hand. And by the time he was 44 years old, they say his heart just gave away, you know. He just killed himself that he was such a hard worker.
Henry died in 1894 at the young age of 49. He left behind his widow Alice and 6 children. Matthew and Lewis both went on to become guides at Mammoth Cave. After the Civil War, one of Materson's daughters, who'd been sold away from the family, returned to Mammoth Cave. Her name was Josephine, and the 1880 census showed that she had once again become part of the Materson household. Josephine had a son with a white neighbor born out of wedlock named William. William also became a cave guide, and in fact represented Mammoth Cave at the 1893 Columbian Exposition in Chicago.
I used to see this real fair-skinned, biracial-looking man in the old Black Family album that we had. And I said, "Daddy, who is this white-looking man?" He said, "That's Will." I said, "Well, did you know Will?" "Yeah, I knew Will." He said, "Will was a grown man when I was 10 years old."
At the Chicago World's Columbian Exposition of 1893, the Minerals and Mining Building housed a recreation of the Star Chamber in Mammoth Cave. The treat feature of the exhibit will be the reproduction in miniature of the Mammoth Cave. The Negro attendant who has guided so many thousands of visitors through the cave will be here to explain, as only he can explain, the beauties of the exhibit.
Will could go to Nashville, Tennessee, and in a neighborhood where he wasn't known as simply pass for white. So when he got aboard the train at Cave City to venture on to Chicago, he said, when the train stops to get water for the steam engine, William said, "I wonder what it would be like to ride up there with those white folks." So he says, I decided I was just going to go up front and ride in the first class car with white folks. He said the conductor never knew I was a man of color, and I never told him. So I rode on Chicago with those white folks, and they never knew. William was up there for about 5 months. So as William was coming back to Mammoth Cave after the World's Fair appointment, he said, I'd gotten down to Louisville, Kentucky, getting really close to Mammoth Cave, and I realized that it was time for me to take a seat in the all-colored car. And so I took my place in the colored car. And when he gotten back to Mammoth Cave, my dad said he would laugh and talk with the Bransford boys and told them his adventure in Chicago, and a lot of people thought he was a Caucasian guy, and I never let on like what I was or not, you know. And that was a little family joke that went around for a long time.
William Garvin was a Civil War veteran. He joined the 12th U.S. Colored Heavy Infantry on February 7, 1865, in Bowling Green, Kentucky. The company mustered out in April 1866. After the war, William came to Mammoth Cave and became a guide. While at the cave, he met and married Hannah Bransford, daughter of Nick Bransford.
Lots of letters are written about his personality with the group, how he was very good at explaining the cave, telling jokes, bantering back and forth with the visitors. Some people say in the letters that he was also a ventriloquist, that he could throw his voice in the cave passageways and kind of create illusions with the lanterns. And we also know that he was a good cave explorer. He's credited for discovering the Corkscrew, which is a passageway that leads from the lowest levels of the cave back up to the upper levels of the cave to gain access back to the entrance. Sort of a bypass that would cut off an extra hour of travel through the cave.
An 1890 account describes a trip through the Corkscrew Passage led by William Garvin. We thought we knew William and trusted him, but he abused our confidence. First, a long and perpendicular ladder. Then we were turned loose at the bottom of the great well and dug our way out through 350 feet of boulders, always upwards toward the surface, each following the other's heels until twisted out of all shape and semblance of humanity. We gathered as mournful wrecks in the vast amphitheater or lobby of the cave, and when at last the guide unbarred the prison gate of the cavern, and we saw the glorious sunlight and bathed in the limpid stream which flows in the wild wood nearby, we were glad we were alive. In 1891, Frances Benjamin Johnson was the first woman to extensively photograph within Mammoth Cave. She published her photographs and commentary in a book, Mammoth Cave by Flashlight. In the book, she talks about William Garvin.
All through the siege of Black Depths, with photographic flash pattern, William was my most trusted ally and aided very materially in the ultimate success of the venture.
William and Hannah had several children and lived in a small cabin near the cave. He applied for and received disability from the Army in 1886 and passed away in 1906.
Ed Bishop, he became one of the exploring guides here at Mammoth Cave. He was the great-nephew of Stephen Bishop. Continued a long legacy of making new discoveries while he worked and guided at Mammoth Cave. Ed Bishop's association with Max Kemper is probably one of the greatest legacies that we have from Ed Bishop. Max Kemper was a German who came to visit. He came to visit Mammoth Cave along his travels in the States and really became fascinated with the Mammoth Cave, wanted to explore it, study it more, eventually worked out an arrangement to survey the cave and make a map for the management. Ed Bishop became his guide, and together those two began exploring Mammoth Cave in 1908, mapping and surveying all the known passageways of Mammoth Cave. And during this 8-month expedition of them mapping, they made many new discoveries as well. A lot of those new discoveries were named by them, named after family members and children, neighbors and associates. And we still have those place names in the cave today.
Ed named 4 of his Mammoth Cave discoveries after his children. Ed Bishop guided in the cave for 41 years, from 1886 until 1917. He was described as a handsome, stocky man, a mulatto, and a strong caver. He spent many years exploring the cave with the other exploring guides, Will Bransford, William Garvin, and Ed Hawkins.
Ed Hawkins worked in the Mammoth Cave Hotel. He was a very large man. He had very huge hands. And there's a historic photo of him wearing clothes with large safety pins because his hands were so large it was hard to button the buttons on his shirt, so he would use these large safety pins to hold his clothes together in his coat to be latched. He was very well known for how he could pluck a chicken with one swipe of his hand. He did work in the hotel, defeathering chickens and for the cooks to fry up. He also did help in the exploration of Mammoth Cave.
Ed Hawkins made his mark in Mammoth Cave with his contributions to its exploration. There is a passage, Hawkins Way, named for him in the cave. In 1906, a party that included Ed Hawkins, William Bransford, and tourist Benjamin Einbegler discovered cathedral domes, one of the most impressive set of vertical shafts in the entire cave, on the far side of Echo River from the historic entrance. This is not his only tie to the Bransford family. The 1880 census shows Ed Hawkins as a 21-year-old young man residing with Henry Bransford and his family. Also listed on the census living in the household are Henry's sons, and future cave guides Lewis, 4 years old, and month-old Matthew Bransford. Matthew Mat Warren Bransford was born in 1880 and began guiding tours in Mammoth Cave around 1900. By the latter part of the 19th century, the Mammoth Cave Hotel was segregated and only whites were able to stay there. Blacks were not allowed on the same tours as white visitors, even though the tours were often still being led by black guides. Matt was not only a guide for these tours at Mammoth Cave, but a businessman. He and his wife Zimmy opened up their home as the Bransford Summer Resort to black visitors unable to find lodging at the Mammoth Cave Hotel, and led special tours for these black visitors into the cave. According to one business card, meals and lodging there were $2.50 per day.
I was told by my dad and other folks in the family that Mat Bransford had quite a resort up Flint Ridge, well respected in the community. Dad said once a month or so he would string lights down across the orchard, and maybe a brass band would come from St. Louis, Missouri, and blacks and whites would come from Flint Ridge and have just real great social times. You know, he was a community figure, well respected. One of the first to have a 1929 Chevy there. And they say he was a man that that really came up from nothing, and he recognized the business potential of having that hotel. So I take it was as nice a hotel as you'd ever have. As a matter of fact, in my basement here where we are now, I have a picture or two that was once in the old Bransford Hotel that he gave my dad before he passed on. They said the furnishings and the quality of the food, that his wife was a great cook, said it was second to none. So he made it clear that if you were a person of color and you came to Mammoth Cave at this time in Mammoth Cave history, and you didn't have a place to stay, that people of color couldn't stay at the old Mammoth Cave Hotel. He says, come on up, tell the cab driver when you arrive about you wanting to go to Bransford's Hotel. And said the cab driver will surely bring you on. And he says, for a reasonable price, we'll put you up as nice as anybody. And they say he did just that.
Louis Bransford, Henry Bransford's son, served many years as a guide. He had two sons, Clifton and Elsie, who also worked as guides. Three of his nephews, Arthur, Eddie, and George, worked as guides as well. At one time in the 1920s, out of a guide corps of around 20 people, 8 of the guides were direct descendants of Madison Bransford. In 1931, this photo of the guide corps at Mammoth Cave was taken. It shows 20 guides. The photo includes 6 members of the Bransford family: Will, Matt, Louis, Elsie, George, Arthur, and Clifton. Edie Bransford also guided for a brief time in this era. There are 3 other black guides shown: Bob Lively, John Much Hunter, and Louis Brown. The photo also shows 5 members of the Hunt family: Schuler, Leon, Young, Charlie, and Leo. The other Caucasian guides in the photo are Siebert and Lloyd Wilson, Lyman Cutliff, and Lester Carney. For most of these men, guiding and working at Mammoth Cave was a family tradition dating back to the 1800s. Louis was the last of the family to leave the guide service. He retired in 1939 after his family had led tours in the cave continuously for 101 years. He had been called aside and told that there was not going to be a place for black guides when the non-integrated National Park Service took over the cave. Mammoth Cave became a national park in 1941.
I can't be entirely sure how everybody felt, but I knew that my grandfather realized early on that there was no need to resist. I was told by Mat Bransford, 3rd generation, who owned a hotel and restaurant, that he was actually sent as a spokesman to the owner of the Mammoth Cave Estates, that black and white families asked him if he would represent them to see if there was a possibility that some of them could be spared, their property could be spared. You know, Matt had the hotel up there that he had his lifelong investment in. They knew nothing but Mammoth Cave National Park. Most of those fellows had probably never ventured more than 30 miles from where they were born and raised. So when they realized what was about to happen, there was great fear and anxiety, and they had hoped that there was a chance that they could be spared. But not only did Mat Bransford lose his job as a renowned expert tour guide, he lost his place of business. He lost his land, he lost his business. And sometimes I think about just how hard that would have been.
Even though Mammoth Cave National Park was not formally dedicated until 1941, by the mid-1930s, the National Park Service had already begun acquiring properties in the Mammoth Cave area through purchase and forced eviction through eminent domain. Families who lived there since the region was first settled were displaced. This also was the height of the Great Depression. Millions of people were out of work. President Franklin Roosevelt created the Civilian Conservation Corps, the CCC, to provide work for many of these people doing public work projects. 4 camps were eventually built at Mammoth Cave beginning in 1933. The CCC crews built most of the surface trails, built trails in the cave, built roads for cars, cabins, and much of the infrastructure you see in the park today. The CCC was a life raft for over 3 million young men and their families. One such man was former cave guide Edie Bransford.
Guiding passed from father to son, and my grandfather Elsie was already training my 10-year-old dad Edward when he was called in the office and told, not only are you losing your jobs, but you're also going to have to leave the land. After 100 years and surviving slavery and the Civil War, they were now being kicked off the land to make way for a national park. He had to go home and tell his wife and 2 younger children that the only world they had ever known was about to change. They were paid a fair price, as defined by the government, and were pushed out into the middle of the Great Depression in 1938. It took a while, but he had been accepted to the CCC. It was good money, and it made sure your family was being fed. And for him, it meant returning to the cave, except this time above ground. What must it have felt like to return knowing that what you were going to be doing was building roads across what used to be your land? Elsie's dad, Lewis, was the last black guide to turn in his keys. And it started a period where the history of the black guides was systematically diminished until it was almost forgotten. I don't recall Lewis, but I do remember Elsie. He didn't talk much about the cave except when around his brother and cousins who had been there too. I wonder if it was because he didn't want people to know how great it really had been and that the world would never be the same.
After the National Park Service took over the property, the tours of the cave and exploration of the cave continued. Cave explorers from the National Speleological Society and the Cave Research Foundation over the next few decades managed to connect many of the large caves in the park area, Salts, Unknown, and Colossal, and Crystal Cave, into 2 large systems. But the connection passage between the 2 systems remained elusive. That changed in 1972, and even that story has a connection to Stephen Bishop.
In 1972, we found a connection beneath Houchins Valley to Mammoth Cave, making it the longest cave in the world. Shortly after, we discovered that this passage is shown on Stephen Bishop's schematic sketch map of Mammoth Cave as coming off of Echo River. In a subsequent map that was an accurate survey in 1907, that passage is no longer on the map. And what happened in between was that a dam was built in Brownsville that raised the water level, and most times of the year that passage was underwater.
Jerry Bransford had been working with Joy Medley Lyons, Chief of Program Services for the National Park Service at Mammoth Cave, in an attempt to learn more about his family. In 2003, after retiring from his previous occupation, he applied to be a seasonal tour guide and unfortunately was turned down. In 2004, he reapplied, and this time he was accepted. When Jerry Bransford led his first group of tourists into Mammoth Cave, it was the first Bransford to do so in over 65 years. Jerry Bransford is using his time at Mammoth Cave to reconnect with his ancestors and to bring their stories to light.
I like being a guide at Mammoth Cave National Park because I have opportunity to walk in the footsteps of generations of old kinfolk that were there way before now. I do think our family history in Mammoth Cave is an interesting American story. Slaves, escorting free people, looking after free people's welfare, people of royalty, renowned slave guides known around the world. I don't consider myself even fitting in the category of generations ahead of me. But what I do feel is that I want to do the best job that I can in their behalf. Sometimes it brings kind of a tear to my eye and breaks my heart because I realize that so much we're taking from them, something that their livelihood and their property, and for years our story went untold. I feel a drive inside of me to let people know the accomplishments that they had there at Mammoth Cave, but I also feel the gladness that I can share our story with the world.
When I'm guiding tours, one of the things I do like to tell visitors, so we want them to find some sort of connection with Mammoth Cave. I tell them that I have a connection with Mammoth Cave. It has become a passion of mine that I really It's more than a job to me. I love coming here. Even if I didn't work here, I would probably be up here all the time. So Mammoth Cave means something to me. But when I think of people like Stephen Bishop and Mat and Nick Bransford and Ed Bishop and William Garvin, and to think what the cave meant to those people and the connection they had with Mammoth Cave, exploring the cave, having the freedom to travel and see what they got to see during slavery. I don't know. I love telling visitors about that connection, how Mammoth Cave connects with everybody in their own personal life.
Ring them bells for me, Lord. Ring your bells for me. Ring your bells, and I'll come running home. I'll be waiting by the gate. Tell them angels I won't be late. When I hear this sweet, sweet song, I'll know then it won't be long till I come home. Won't be long. It won't be long. Ring them bells for me, Lord. Ring them bells for me. Ring them bells, and I'll come running home. Ring them bells for me, Lord.
To order a DVD or digital download of the Black Guides of Mammoth Cave program, please visit www.blackguidesofmammothcave.com.